Everyone, welcome to
Life Edge.
Life Edge.
Because life just doesn't have to be that mediocre.
I have laryngitis. Here we go. This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation at www.relate.com, your training and video partner.
Hello, I'm Peter Baker. Please visit voiceovermasterclass.com to see details of the training courses I have on offer for new and existing voice talents to further their career by enhancing voice and technical skills, as well as essential marketing tips.
And joining us today in that center position of power, we've got Dr. Ed Stuart. Definitely our favorite economist out there and a friend of the show. We love having him on. And Ed, how are you today?
Great. Good to see you, Rick, and you, Harold. Nice to be back.
I'm glad to have you back, and I'm glad you came back safely. Dr. Ed just went on a trip to Russia again. You took a class with you this time, right?
Yes, I took a group of students and a couple of retired librarians. We were a group of 10 in all, traveling by rail, mainly from Irkutsk in Siberia all the way to Moscow, about 6,000 kilometers by rail.
Wow. Now, that in itself must have been quite a journey.
I'm a train rider. I think we may have talked about this before. And I had actually made this trip once before in 1998 with my mom, just my mom and I. And so I was somewhat familiar with that. Although I must say, in the 20 intervening years, the quality and service on the Russian railroads is much improved and quite comfortable and very, very punctual.
I was watching a commercial the other day for that. It was actually for the Russian rail. I think it was like Siberian Express or something. And they said, if you take this and if you go in business class or whatever class they were talking about, there's only about 20 people in the whole class. And it looked lovely. It looked very posh and they treated you well. And the Russians have learned how to smile now, which is good because we talked about this on the last show. Smiling was considered dangerous.
Right. We were kind of in the middle class, semi-poor professor student class, so we were in between the upper class and the what you might call still the proletariat back in lower class. So there were four bunks in each cabin, and but we had good food served in the cabin, and as always, there was a samovar at the end of the car, and the little Providnitsa lady, when she wasn't very busy vacuuming and dusting and polishing, would make you tea or coffee with the hot water from the samovar. And so it was very, very comfortable, and we spent a lot of time on the train. We were on 3 overnights, and one of the overnights from Irkutsk to Novosibirsk was actually about 36 hours. So we were on a whole day and almost 2 nights.
So are you able to do a little bit of tourism when you get off?
Oh, yes. We spent 2 days in Irkutsk. That was our first stop. I went swimming in Lake Baikal, the largest body of fresh water on Earth. I didn't go swimming for long because the temperature was about 45 degrees. So I went in and went out. And then fortunately, Masha, our guide, had a bottle of vodka for us. I didn't have a bottle of vodka. I had a little sip. But it did the task of kind of warming you up and getting your blood flowing again. And we toured. One of the things, Rick, that's different this time, and I noticed that I did a scouting trip we talked about back in October, is the tremendous growth and influence of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yes. So these days, when you tour Russia, instead of going to sanctified Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev sites, now you go to reopened churches. In fact, in Irkutsk, we had a whole morning of bell ringing lessons by Alexander, the chief bell ringer and teacher of bell ringing at the Sacred Word Cathedral,
That sounds
which
fun.
had been refurbished in the last 5 or 10 years. And so we toured a lot of churches in Baikal. On the shores of Lake Baikal, there's a really fabulous museum. It's a combination biology and geology and hydrology and environmental science. We were talking before we went on the air about earthquakes, and Baikal, this big, huge lake in the middle of Siberia, was formed by an earthquake. And just like Harold was saying, that in a million years, you guys are going to be up to San Francisco. I don't know how many million years, but in a million or so years, Baikal will be gone because the plates will have moved such that that particular depth of water will be eliminated. So that was fascinating.
Now, the churches, if they were, if it's only been recently that a lot of these churches have kind of reopened for people visiting them and stuff, have they done a lot of like renovation on these things recently? And
yes, they've done. The renovations have only been done in the last 10 years. Now, a lot of the pre-revolutionary churches are gone. Our big cathedrals were blown up and bulldozed. And so the ones that are left, Harold, during the Soviet period, some of them were museums, some of them were schools, some of them were, things like stables and cafeterias. So they've had to do really multi-million-dollar renovation.
Wow. So these were ones that were churches before, but during the Soviet period they had converted them, or or just shuttered them, and let them deteriorate and collapse. Now there are also new cathedrals that have been built. Stopped in Ekaterinburg for 2 days, where I had spent a semester in the 1990s, and Ekaterinburg was the site where the Tsar and his family were murdered, right? In fact, there's a show, I think it may be on Netflix, called The Last Tsars, which I really recommend. And it leads up to their murder, the whole family in Ekaterinburg. And when I was first in Ekaterinburg in 1994, the house where the Romanov family had been murdered had actually been torn down because it was a site of remembrance and kind of opposition to the Soviet government. And as a matter of fact, somewhat ironically, the local official who had ordered the destruction of this house was Boris Yeltsin, who was the first secretary of the Sverdlovsk Oblast. Now, when you go to that site, there is this huge cathedral of the spilt blood, which one of my diseases as an economist, I'm kind of like Oscar Wilde. I know the price of everything and the value of nothing. My estimate for the price of this new cathedral in Ekaterinburg has got to be over $100 million because it is huge, and it is marble and gold and stained glass and mahogany and all of the semi-precious stones that are found in the mines around Ekaterinburg, malachite and other kinds of minerals. So and there is a brand new cathedral in Moscow that replaces the one that was blown up by, I don't know whether it was Lenin or Stalin, but blown up in the early 20s, and it's a multi-$100 million edifice as well. Now, when they build these architecturally, are they going for kind of imperial period look, or are they trying to
that's an excellent question, Harold. They're going for an exact replica of what existed before 1917. There are no modern churches. There are no Frank Gehry inspired structures or anything like that, or Mies van der Rohe, or I'm forgetting the guy in France who designed all the banlieues. And anyway, there are no
This is all this is going back to the past. And actually, Harold, that's a really good question. Because one of the things, not only are they going back to the past in terms of the building, but there's a rehabilitation going on of the Romanovs, and especially Nicholas II and Alexandra, who, at least according to my readings of Russian history, was pretty much of an idiot and a terrible czar. But now he's a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. And when you listen to various guides, you can tell they're giving a kind of positive spin or trying to smooth off some of the edges.
Do they call him a hero now?
Almost, yes. Right, a martyr at least. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, is this being funded by the state or by public or by private or a combination of the two?
That's a good question, Rick. That's one of the things in Russia. The mixture of the state and the private and the religious, there is no clear distinction, right? The state and private are pretty much the same thing. The Russian Orthodox Church owns some certain kinds of resources. They have a certain brand of mineral water. They also, and I may be a little bit off on this, they had the monopoly on the importing of cigarettes and alcohol.
Interesting.
Who better, right?
Yeah.
Who better? Yeah, right.
That's
so they had some kind of government ordered or government allowed license that allowed them to make a very large income stream on a regular basis. And also, there's a symbiotic relationship between the Putin regime and the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay. Putin supports the Orthodox support Putin.
Okay. They scratch each other's back. It's good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to go back to Harold's really good question, it's kind of like the Roman Catholic Church and the absolute monarchies in pre-revolutionary France.
Right.
It's that kind of a relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And also, you do see a certain amount of religious practice in ordinary people. We were in one of the hotels we were in at breakfast. I was getting my coffee and scrambled eggs and going back to my table, and there was a Russian family at another table, and the man made the Russian sign of the cross before he started eating. Now, if you'd done that before 1991, you would have. Well, he was already in Siberia, so they would have done something worse to him. But
right.
It was a little bit. It wasn't shocking, but it was like a little kind of indicator that kind of took me back a little bit. Say, oh, okay, this is different, because I think I told you on the first time I was your guest, and now I tell my students I'm so old that I've been to the Soviet Union. That my first trip to Russia was in 1985, and if you had made the sign of the cross in public, that wouldn't have been really a death sentence, but your career path or your admission to university or something like that would have certainly been eliminated.
You know, I think I mentioned last time that we work with a Russian company in a city called Yoshkar-Ola, which is about 500 miles northeast of Moscow, kind of off the Volga River, not far. It's beautiful. It's about 125 miles from Kazan, which is a very well-known, it's a Muslim city, actually, within.
Yeah. You go through Kazan when you're on the Trans-Siberian, and you cross the Volga.
Yes, beautiful area. And and they were telling us that they're just, and this is the young kids there, in their 20s, and they go, we're learning how to be religious now. We never really understood it. And the older ones that we know, they're in maybe more 40s and 50s, they're relearning. They said, we've never seen this. This is, for 97 years, we had a horrible dictatorship, and now this is different and new. And they're trying to figure out how to do these things. And when they do marketing, it's sort of interesting because they sent out a Christmas electronic card to all of their customers, and it was all Russian children dancing and singing religious songs in the countryside. It was really cute. And I asked them about them. They said, we don't really understand the card, but we feel that it makes people understand us better, and it's for us, it's something brand new. We're relearning it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Fascinating.
I heard a lecture a long time ago. That this was during the Soviet period. I think it was a history professor from London School, and he said one of the enduring attractions of religion in the Soviet period and the few churches that were open was the hunger for beauty. That all of the Soviet architectures were kind of ugly and big and brutal and heavy and
very gray
and ponderous and so the only place you could see real art and beauty was in the few Russian Orthodox churches that still existed that you could still go in. And so I think we could expand on your point that the Russians are relearning religion, they're relearning history, and they're relearning art appreciation and culture and whatever. Yeah. And I've heard this from many Russian history professors that in some ways, what the task of the post-Soviet period was to take everybody back to 1917 and run the 20th century over again.
And in a way, they're doing that. It's sort of funny when I meet the folks from Russia that we know. They're really sweet. They're really nice folks, all of them.
Oh, yes.
And it reminds me of our 60s.
Yes, right.
They're very different. I mean, they're not quite, and in a way, it's good because our current time, I'm not sure, is all that great, but they're very nice. They seem to be quite family-oriented. They're very friendly. They respect the bonds of friendship, if you will, and they talk a lot about family and how they're rebuilding bonds that may have been lost throughout the years. It's really fascinating.
Right. Yeah. And yes, they're friendly. They're very polite. They remind me of the kids I went to Catholic school with 50 some odd years ago.
Yep. It's kind of fun to watch them. And sometimes I think, what happened to us? Because they're kind of like us back when. It's sort of similar. I mean, I think we've become more nuclear, colder in a lot of ways, and they're very warm.
Yes, yeah. There's certain limits to American individualism, and I'll get mine, and whatever that can be taken too far. And I think you're right, Rick. I think in a lot of ways we've taken that too far.
Well, it's sort of funny because there is something to be said about individualism. But ultimately, nobody's an individual by himself.
Right.
We're all part of a macro society, and no matter how much you want to live on an island by yourself, it doesn't happen. At least not often.
No. Yeah, I have students who say, "Yes, I want to live on an island all by myself." I say, "Yeah, and what are you going to have on that island?" Well, I'll have the internet, and I'll have
the internet.
And I'll have cable. Yeah, right. Okay, you're really going to be the Robinson Crusoe. Yeah.
How would you say?
And I'll have Grubhub delivering pizza. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So true.
How would you say the students that you brought on the trip reacted to the kind of cultural differences between here and there?
That's a really interesting question. Even though there were only 10, I had 10. Of course, this goes back to Rick and our discussion of individuals. I had 10 individuals. So I had one young lady whose parents are kind of Marxist or something like that. So she was upset that the Soviet Union had gone away, right? Right. And I had one slightly older Latino male who was probably the most fervent Trump supporter in my group, and he was thinking that individualism and free enterprise hadn't gone far enough in Russia. Although he was a little more comfortable with the current situation. And then the rest were, I think we were really good travelers in that I always tell my travelers, keep your eyes open and your ears open and your mouth shut. And you don't really learn anything by talking, especially if you're, to quote Robert Heinlein, stranger in a strange land. And Russia really is strange. It's not like going to the Netherlands or Germany
No.
or even Japan. It's like I was talking to Harold about. They're in some way reliving the 20th century, and therefore they've got a very, very different history, and it's a struggling time. I would not want to be a Russian right now.
Right. Yeah.
It is tough, and you've got 30 years since they became
somebody in Moscow. Go ahead, Rick. Excuse me.
I was just saying, and it's only been about 30 something years since they've become independent. And like the people we know, they said they're relearning how not to be afraid.
Yes, exactly. And how to trust somebody and not. Right. And if somebody is speaking, don't, no word about speaking too loud because somebody might hear you.
Right.
And, right.
How would you say, over the years that you've been visiting Russia, how has penetration of English language and English education there changed?
Harold, I may have told you the story the very first time I came on, but my first time in the Soviet Union was 1985, and I took students through. Actually, we were in Russia and the Ukraine, and one of the places we visited was Yaroslavl, which is also on the Volga. And we took a little cruise with a group of Russian students who were learning English, and they had actually had a choice between learning English and learning either French or German. And the teacher said that almost all of her students, this is 1985, all of her students opted to learn English. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, they have all these bootleg Michael Jackson tapes, and they want to know the word name, right? So what Michael Jackson didn't do for English, the Beatles did, and before that, Elvis Presley. But actually, the spread of English is more and more noticeable. And one of the things that drove it was the World Cup last year. In Moscow, in Ekaterinburg, and I think it's true also in St. Petersburg. Now, if you go on the subway, the metro, which is the only way to get around Moscow, there are dual language signs. They're in Russian and English.
Wow.
And we were mainly in the tourist infrastructure, railroads, airlines, airports, hotels, not fancy, actually nice hotels. That's another thing, Rick. There are more and more middle-class hotels that 10 years ago, the tourist infrastructure, hotels and restaurants, either you were a billionaire oligarch and could afford $500 or $600 for a bottle of champagne, or you ate Russian dumplings, right, for 10 cents a piece and hope that you lived until the end of dinner. Right? It reminded me of the old Rodney Dangerfield joke about how bad his wife's cooking was. It was so bad that we pray after eating, right?
Yeah.
So in the good old Soviet and post-Soviet days, I always prayed after I ate. So that's driving English, Harold, and also the internet, and Russians now more or less can travel, right? And surprisingly enough, they don't want a vacation in Belarus or Azerbaijan necessarily. They want a vacation in
Las
Nice
Vegas
or Cannes or Barcelona, Miami Beach, right?
Yep.
And so that also is driving it. And not so much true in Russia just yet, but I noticed this when I teach in Western Europe. Graduate schools in business are almost all conducted in English. Even if there are no English speakers in the class.
Fascinating.
And that hasn't come to Russia yet in a big way, but it's come to certain business schools and economic schools in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
That's interesting. I still keep thinking that a lot of people here don't see it. I think because they're just not either paying attention or reading up on it. But the U.S. and the Russians have a lot in common. in a lot of different ways. And even in today's day and age, as all the breakups of partnerships and this and that and whatever is going on in our world, we Russians and U.S. probably could have, or probably do have, we just don't know about it, some of the best relationships around. And it's sort of interesting.
Exactly.
I was reading some stuff on was it YouTube? I wasn't reading it on YouTube. It was reading somewhere else on the web that I can't remember who the author was, but they were talking that all through the Cold War, the Russian military and the U.S. military were quite friendly with each other. They knew each other. They worked together. There was a lot of co-development of different programs. And so, what you see on TV isn't the reality of what really is happening more often than not between the acting of politicians and the real reality of what goes on behind the scenes. We seem to be closer than ever.
We've got astronauts and cosmonauts circling the Earth right now that are Russian and American.
That's true.
Yeah. It's an excellent point, Rick. We're the two big countries. We're the two big powers, right? And we have essentially an Atlantic and a Pacific coast, just like the Russians do. One of the things we visited in Irkutsk was a Cossack fort. Now, the Cossacks were almost the exact equivalent of the U.S. cavalry.
Yeah.
They were ethnically cleansing the east of Buryats, and actually, they were ethnically cleansing the ancestors of the American Indians who had come across Bering Strait
over the Bering Strait
thousands of years ago. And so you're in this Cossack fort on the outskirts of Irkutsk, and it's half timbered logs, and they've got horses and cavalry kind of uniforms, and you go, aha, I have seen this before, right? But I saw it in Wyoming and Montana and Oregon and elsewhere. And so we have all kinds of things. And I don't know if I pointed this out before, but I always tell my students, and I sometimes get in trouble if I'm talking in more conservative universities, I owe my life to the Red Army.
Yes.
My father was shot down out of a B-17, put in a Luftwaffe prison camp in the north of Germany, and liberated by the Red Army marching to Berlin. So I always point that out when I'm in Russia. That gives me a little bit of stature. I also always point out, if there's any kind of danger around, I always point out that I'm from Chicago. Right? And that always causes people to back up just a little bit.
Right, naturally.
That's good.
And like you were saying, Rick, what you see on television or whatever, Chicago, not everybody is shooting everybody else in Chicago. It's really a nice, peaceful city. I don't tell them that. I let them assume that everybody is shooting everybody in Chicago, and they're my friends, and they're not far away.
Actually, speaking of organized crime, do you know much about how much that's changed in Russia nowadays? Because from what I understand, the 90s were very...
That's the key question, Harold. And the key question is that organized crime is now regularized and centralized in private property. It is part of the Putin regime, right? One of the dangerous things about Russia is to be a billionaire, because with the stroke of a pen, Vladimir Putin can make you a poverty-stricken prisoner, right? And so
I guess that goes back to what you were saying about the state and the private sector being very...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So companies like Gazprom and Lukoil and Rosneft, the big oil companies and natural gas companies, and Norilsk, Nickel, those companies are all owned by billionaires, but those billionaires serve at the daily pleasure of Vladimir Putin. And so that's one of the scary things. It's not a democracy. Right? It is an oligarchy. One of the other reasons, Rick, I told students that the best policy, and I would try to follow, would be to keep my eyes open and my ears open and my mouth shut, right? And that We were not going to make political statements or profess allegiance or criticism. We were there to learn, and that was all we were going to do.
Yeah. Which is wise.
The one little scary thing that happened was that the Sunday we arrived in Moscow, which was the 29th of September, there was a demonstration, an anti-Putin demonstration in Moscow.
Interesting.
And my student, who was the more radical and kind of boisterous one of the group, as soon as we arrived at the train station, at the Kazansky train station in Moscow, she hopped off the train and ran to join the demonstration.
Oh, gosh.
And the other students said, "Professor Stuart, why are you upset?" And I said, well, because she can be disappeared in a second, and there's no lawyer, there's no habeas corpus, there's no independent judiciary. She could just be gone.
You see, she was just trying to take the quick way back to Siberia.
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of interesting. And of course, I'm a little cynical because sometimes I think the anti-Putin group may actually be put up by the Putin people to make it look like he's unpopular. You never know.
You don't really know. You
just
really
don't know.
Yeah.
And so this girl shows up and joins them, and they arrest her.
Yeah, and she doesn't speak any Russian.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And that's the thing. I think I understand a little bit about Soviet economics and post-Soviet economics and a little bit of history, but my German is much better. So I understand Germany and Austria better because I know the language. I know a little bit of the Russian language, but not very much. And unless you know the Russian language really, really well, and the slang, and the current slang, and the current kind of sarcasm or implied criticism, you really don't know, you really can't make an informed judgment as to what's going on, or as you said, Rick, who is who.
Who's who? Because there's a lot of that. Yeah. Even in the U.S., we have the same. We don't know what
even
groups
in the US,
arguing what. There's so much BS going on. And it's just sort of interesting. Yeah, I learned. I lived in Argentina for 3 years when they had their dirty war against terrorism. Yeah, you didn't say certain things out loud because you could be disappeared. You could be arrested. You just had to be careful who you were talking to because people watched. And now, mind you, aside from that part, which wasn't great, it was probably one of the safest cities in the world back then in Buenos Aires. Because they got rid of all the problems, except you had one problem, and that was the military or police, which decided, we need somebody to clean up our precinct tonight. Oh, let's just get those guys. They look like students. And that's what would happen. So you just had to keep your nose out of trouble. Don't say anything. Like I said, you could have the best life on earth as long as you didn't get into politics.
Exactly. And that's probably a perfectly valuable recipe for living in Russia now and surviving. Yeah. You can make money. You can have a nice life. It's kind of a one-dimensional life, to go back to Herbert Marcuse and One-Dimensional Man. You can't be involved in politics. You really can't be involved in culture in the sense of a discussion about religion, criticizing or whatever. And so it's a little bit tough. Actually, it's a lot tough.
And the Russians know it, but they know when to speak up and when not to. Our friend Yuri, who lives over there, he did something that I thought was fascinating. He lives in a town, like I said, 500 miles from Moscow, and I don't know if he's still doing this, but on weekends he would go to a park and explain to people about the heroes of Russia before the Soviets, explain about who they are, what they are, and how they should be proud of their lives and themselves. And he would get 20, 50, 100 people going by and listening and going, wow, we didn't know that. And it was really quite fascinating. And the people who worked at the company thought he was a hero for doing that. It was just really fascinating.
It takes a little bit of bravery and courage to do something like that.
And nobody hassled him, but he thought he's a professor. He's also an owner of a company. He's a programmer. He's, I think he's heavily involved in some university. It's a technical university. But, I asked him one time, I go, so what's it like with the FSB or the KGB? When I think I called it at that time. And he goes, they're they're here. He said, what they do is when I leave to the U.S., they go, Yuri left for U.S. And then he said, when I get back, they go, Yuri back from U.S. He goes, they do track, but they don't really get involved anymore. Just watch. And he said, it's okay. It's quiet. He said, it's not like it was. But again, like he said, you don't do certain things.
Right.
Which is probably get involved in politics or try to have a grievance against somebody who is in politics. That would be considered very unwise. And for Americans who have no clue about discretion, that's a hard one. Yeah. That's a real hard one because we don't get the fact that there could be something happening to you. Though all you have to do is look at the news. I mean, who dies and who gets put in prison and for what. We have it. It's just different. It's just a little different. It's at a much higher level.
Yes.
I don't think it's that.
Most of the time, I would say people who get arrested and put in prison in America have done something. Right? Now,
something usually.
Obviously, there are racial differences and class differences and so forth. But, whereas in a place like Argentina or a place like Russia, who gets put in prison is a random variable. In a certain
it could
way.
be. It could be.
And,
I remember once.
I go ahead.
Oh, when I was in Argentina, I remember they were doing what they called operatives or operations. And you'd just be walking down the street. Happened to me one night heading home from a girlfriend's house. And she was about probably 20 blocks from where I lived. Everybody walks. I loved walking down there. And all of a sudden I see the truck with the military on it. And I see the guy in front of me with the submachine gun. And I'm thinking, I could turn down this block, but they may follow me. So I went straight at him. He stopped me and said, puts a machine gun in my stomach and says, documents. I very slowly took out my documents. And I was thinking, I'm a trained martial artist. I've actually trained counterterrorism forces back when I was younger. And so I know a little bit about dealing with that. And I thought I could take his weapon before he had it. If somebody puts a weapon on you, it's not that hard to take it away. If they're 10 feet away, much more difficult. But I was going, but those four or five guys on the truck pointing the machine guns at me, they don't look too good. So I just calmly gave him my passport. He looks at it, not my passport, my document, and he's looking at me. He goes, no glasses here. And I said, they told me to take them off. So I took my glasses off. So everything was slow motion. And he looks, and I wasn't afraid. I was calm. Fear, boy, if they catch fear, they'll probably take you in. Calm makes them wonder, are you somebody that could get me in trouble? That's the mindset.
You have some connection somewhere.
Of a military government. That is the mindset. And so I was calm. So he gave me everything back and said, continue. And that was good. And I went, wow. And then I had to get a national ID document. And that took 5 days. Every day I'm going in lines and lines and lines. And finally, on the last day, they said, you must come with us to the table of confrontation. I went, oh, that doesn't sound good. Mesa de confrontaciones, table of confrontation. I go, oh, geez. So I'm dressed in a three-piece suit. I worked at Citibank at the time. So I looked professional. That was good. They take me to a place. I go inside. And the lieutenant there goes, I'm sorry, we know you didn't do anything, but we're arresting you because you're a military deserter. I go, I've never been in the military here. And I took my test, and I was exempted I had bad eyes, and I was exempted. And he goes, no, we know, but 2,500 other people were exempted that year, and half of them had paid money to be exempted. So they just arrested everybody who had been exempted that year. It was easier. So I got arrested, and I remember at one point, they said, all right, prisoners, get up. And I'm in a group of about 10 prisoners. There's prostitutes there. There's just, I don't know, drunks, whatever. It was just a motley crew. I'm in a suit. And at one point, a guy goes, put your hands behind your back. And I said, no. And he went, oh, okay. And he backed off. I just said, no. I'm not here. This is a mistake. So he backed off on me. The guy behind me says, well, I'm not doing it either. He got a rifle butt in his stomach. And I thought, okay, I better cooperate. I put my hand. I don't want to get anybody hurt. So I said, okay. I cooperate. I got fingerprinted, mugshotted. I went, oh, this sucks. And then I went back, and the captain calls me into his office, and he goes, Zanotti, what are you doing here? I said, that's a good question. I've been asking myself that for the last about 4 or 5 hours. And he said, you don't belong here. You didn't do anything wrong. I know. He goes, okay, you have to get back to the courthouse before 1 o'clock or you have to stay overnight. I went, ugh. So he goes, so here's your papers, get to the courthouse. So the sergeant takes 2 prisoners and myself out to go to the courthouse. And the guy goes, we have no money, so you need to pay. I go, okay, I have the money for a cab. That's fine. We all got into a cab. They take us to the courthouse. I'm looking at my watch. It's 1 o'clock. I go, oh, crap.
Ooh.
5 minutes later, we get there. We're late. I walk in. I don't know what saved me, but maybe it was the suit. I was friendly. I don't know. But this old lady opens the door to where we have to get a stamp. And in Russia, it's the same thing. Everything is with a stamp.
Yeah.
A stamp on a stamp on a stamp. So I had my stamp, and I go to the lady, and she goes, oh, hi, have a seat. And I'm thinking, oh, God, now what's she going to do to me? So I have a seat, and she tells the other 2, send them back. Really mean. And I'm thinking, oh, gosh. So they sent those 2 back, and she goes, would you like a tea? All right. And she treated me like a grandson. It was like, what? Why? How did? Oh, these people, they don't know what they're doing. She was extremely friendly, like I knew her. And I was wondering, do I know her? Is she related to me? I didn't know. But I was there for like an hour talking to her, and then she let me go and have a nice weekend. And I was going, wow. Phew. And then my dad, 2 weeks later, had to come with me to get my paperwork straightened out so that the military district wouldn't arrest me anymore. And he shows up, and he was with Argentina Airlines. He had a pilot's uniform, the bars and everything. He walks in and goes, Sergeant! And the sergeant comes running up, Senor! And I'm going to jail now. I'm dead. He's screaming at these guys. He's not military, but they thought he was. He got it all signed in 5 minutes, and we're gone. That was the end of it. I was going, oof. But that could have gotten me put in jail for a very long time or disappeared if you don't know what you're doing. And it is, and it's the same way in Russia. And I think in Russia it hasn't changed.
No, Americans don't understand an arbitrary system like that. That there aren't rules or procedures, and
there's fear and money.
You need a certain amount of kind of awareness and I don't know.
Oh, my mom, you'll love this. Now you'll love this. To go to Argentina, my mom, who was born there, she goes through customs and she's bringing stuff in, like TVs and stereos, for the family and stuff. So she's bringing stuff down there, and they said she puts a $50 bill in her passport. The guy sees it and says, Sergeant, take her to the cell. So he takes her to the prison cell. And I'm like going, oh, God, no, we're never going to get out of here. So she goes to the prison cell, and she looks at the other guard and goes, psst. And she gives him like $50 or $100. And the guy goes, oh. And he opens the cell and lets her go. And I'm thinking, she just got put into a cell, bribes the other guy to let her out. I don't know what his story will be, and that was it. Right. And we're in. Yeah. And I was thinking, oh, my gosh, if I did that, I'd go to jail. She just works the system. But it's knowing how to work the system. And that's what our friends say there. They go, you need to know how to work the system, and you never, ever go against the system.
Right.
It's always working. I think
one of the problems in Russia is that the system is changing, right? So you need to understand, you need to try to understand what the system is today, right? It's not one of those, like, at least in the Soviet Union, there was a system and it was very rigid and anti-dynamic, but the rules never changed, right? They were unfair, whatever. But Russia today is more fluid and unorganized and less systematic. I mean, you're right, there is a system, but the system today may not be the system tomorrow. And you need more than a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
A lot of smarts and you got to have some wisdom, because anybody with a big mouth, like you said, could get in big trouble very quickly. Very quickly. It's interesting. And so on this trip, did you find it different from the year ago when you went?
A little bit. I'm always the sense of political, what could you call it, unease is a little bit more palpable. And at the same time, the level of the standard of living, at least in the bigger cities, is improving. Right, the transportation infrastructure, the services. There are things like laundries and retail and restaurants and cafes and so forth that didn't exist in the Soviet period and were very rudimentary up until a few years ago. So in that sense, if you're a tourist or you're visiting somebody that has a middle class existence, life is not that unpleasant. Unfortunately, there are 150 million 150 million Russians, and probably 15 million are middle class, and 1 million are very, very upper class, and the other 100 million who live in the countryside and small towns that haven't been sprinkled with the fairy dust of oil money and nickel money and gold and so forth. They're still that's still a struggle.
So that creates a little bit of danger to the government, if you will, when you have that many that are fairly poor.
Exactly. Yeah, because I think the biggest opposition movement to Putin came a year or so ago when he decided to raise the retirement age.
I remember that. Yeah.
So that affected a lot of older Russians who are living on the edge, right? In small towns and rural villages. That is a big change in their standard of living. If you're a 25-year-old marketing assistant for Coca-Cola in Moscow, who cares if the pension age goes up?
Right.
America and Russia are a lot alike in that there are more and more old people. Right? And so things like pensions are a huge issue.
Yeah.
But it's also a big drain on their budget because there are so many old people, and most of those old people depend on their government pensions for the vast majority of their living.
Yeah, and you know what the old saying is, never piss off old people because they have nothing to lose at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so, yeah, the world's an interesting place. Well, Dr. Ed, you know, it's as always a pleasure having you on. One of these days, we're all going to head to Chicago and visit you because we'd have fun.
We should do this at a pizza restaurant and just turn the camera on or the mics on.
That would be cool.
And let Harold do his technical magic, and we can have deep dish and drink Goose Island beer and carry on.
That would be fun. That would be a lot of fun. But we look forward to having you on again on the show. You're always invited. You know that. And again, we appreciate your time today and knowledge and sharing of what your experiences are, because they're fascinating. Not that many Americans have had these experiences. And
I'm a lucky guy. I realize that. And
it's pretty cool. You do get a different viewpoint of life. And, you know, I don't know if you noticed, we had the Russian music for you a couple of times.
Yeah, I know. I like that back there.
It's really nice music. Yeah.
It is nice music.
The first one was Tchaikovsky. I'm not sure what this one is.
I'm not sure. The first one was, the Nutcracker.
Yeah.
Nutcracker, yeah.
And this one is another one that we found. We're trying not to break any copyright infringement, so we have to look carefully.
Right.
But it's nice music. The Russians have beautiful music.
Yeah. Right.
Really great. Anyway, Ed, again, a pleasure to see you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll be in touch very soon.
Okay. Thanks, Rick. Bye,
Take
Harold.
care. Thank you much. Bye-bye. And bye, everyone. Have a good one.